yours seems so low. Yeah. Aloha, aloha everyone. Thank you for joining us for our final installment of Mondays with Maile. And today she's got a great story to share with you, a story of horrible suffering and disaster off the Kona Coast. It's going to be lots of fun. And not to worry, Maile will be back. We're just taking this time to focus on creating more virtual programs and educational programs as well. And Maile will always be with us. So we'll be back, and just, stay tuned via email. If you're a member, you're going to get emails from us that update you on our current programming. And if you're not a member, you can go to our website and join us. So thank you for joining us today. Maile is just arriving, so I'm going to move out and let Maile take over. So enjoy. Aloha.
Ha ha! It is me, Maile, and I'm wearing my mask because we're all supposed to wear our masks to be kind to other people, aren't we? It's not about us, it's about them. All right, I am going to tell you a wonderful story that was entitled A True Tale of Horrible Suffering at Sea off the Hawaii coast, and that means our coast, the Big Islands coast. So, I was going to start by saying today is August 10th, and it's a Monday here in Kona, and just 2 weeks ago, it was a Monday here in Kona, and it was the day after Hurricane Douglas swept by. Sunday, Hurricane Douglas went north of the Hawaiian Islands and up the chain, but we were spared horrible suffering. We were very grateful. So on the morning of Monday, I was standing out on my grassy lawn looking out towards the beautiful blue Pacific Ocean, and I saw an unusual sight. I saw a Coast Guard cutter heading north up along the coast, and I knew it was a Coast Guard cutter because I got up by my binoculars and I looked at it, and Coast Guard cutters are white with a big red diagonal mark at their bow, so I knew it was an official boat. And then you could read the newspaper, and it said, the crew of the U.S., cutter Kimball had rescued a kayaker in his craft, his kayak, 6 miles off of South Point. That is the southernmost tip of our island, and this kayak was 6 miles off in the ocean. And very fortunately, he had a cell phone or some way of getting hold of people so he could say, help, help. And here came, this is a nice quote, this is the newspaper, a kayaker isolated at sea by treacherous ocean conditions was rescued by first responders of the U.S. Coast Guard and the Hawaii County Fire Department. Well, that's very good. And then we had the official word from Honolulu, which said, even the most experienced mariner can find themselves in trouble when out on the ocean, and that is especially true following a large storm. And this was Jonathan Lackey, petty officer, 2nd class. So what does happen when you're out at sea and you're not an experienced mariner? Well, let's find out. So here we are, here at Kona Historical, and you know what we like to do with Maile's Meanderings and Maile's Musings, we turn back, but maybe we turn it back this way, counterclockwise. We're going back in time, going back 153 years. And what we're going to do, it is August, and August is traditionally an extremely hot month here in Kona. I'm wearing Pixie's Navas's lei she made for me. Hey Pixie, if you're watching, I'm wearing your lei. I really like it. It's making my neck nice and toasty. So, it's a hot August in 1867, 153 years ago. King Kamehameha V, sometimes known as the Bachelor King, was ruling the island, the Kingdom of Hawaii, from Honolulu. The census revealed that the population of the Hawaiian Islands was only 62,959 people. So let's say 63,000 people in the entire Hawaiian Kingdom. And soon it would only be like 57,000. But it was strange. So he's the king. You have this tiny bunch of islands and a tiny population. It was apparently, work was hard to find here in the Hawaiian Kingdom at that time. And in the newspapers you would have read depression, economic depression. So people were trying to think of ways to make money. Because they were hungry. So on August 6th, 1867, a letter arrived in Honolulu for Mr. W.C. Park, Esquire, Marshal of the Hawaiian Islands. And this letter was sent from here in Kona by R.B. Neville. He is the sheriff here in Kona. He's an Englishman. He's been living in Honolulu for a while, but he has moved to Kona. He goes to Christ Church, the little Episcopalian church right up the road. He is married to a Hawaiian lady. He has children. And Sheriff Neville is in a bit of a quandary when he writes in August of 1867. And he's writing down to Honolulu, and he says, "My dear sir, it is my painful duty to inform you of one of the most melancholy events that has ever come to my lot to have anything to do with. Some time ago, there was a sloop of about 4 to 5 tons built in South Kona by 2 men, one of the name of Rogers, who used to be in business in Honolulu as a blacksmith, and Mr. Young. On Sunday, July 21st, Rogers, so one of the builders of the boat, and a man, I think you know him well by the name of Glennie, the same that exposed his person in Honolulu some time since, and also another man named Stone, started for Ka'u, but did not get farther than Kapalilua. Okay, so we're trying to sail down the western coast of the island of Hawaii, so we're going from Kealakekua Bay, and we're heading south to South Point, where that kayaker was blown out to sea. But they didn't get to South Point. They only got to Kapalilua, at which place Stone got out and went overland to Ka'u. The sloop, that's a little sailing boat, the sloop started again for Ka'u, but was driven off the course by strong winds, and was next day picked up and towed inshore by the Kona packet. Now this is a little vessel that frequents the West Hawaii coast and is very smart and has a nice captain called Captain Marchant. So the Kona packet picks the little red bird up, hauls it inshore, and gives it water. It says you can have as much food and water as you want, but stay close to the shore and don't go too far out. Well, that night, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Glennie drank all the water they got from the Kona packet, and they found themselves the next morning far out at sea. And from that time until August 3rd, nothing more was seen of them. So this is like 10 days from August, from July 23rd. Now we're in August 3rd. It's pretty bad. Nothing more was seen of them. And we had given up all hopes of seeing them again. But on the 3rd inst, we see the sloop out on the blue Pacific Ocean, about 15 miles off the land. And about sunset, the sloop ran into the rocks. And then the sad story was told. All right, this is Sheriff Neville's letter. Some natives who had been fishing thought that something was the matter. Well, yes, the boat is rocking back and forth on the rocks. For crying out loud, it's making a clunky, clunky sound. And these natives are out there in their canoes, and they're fishing because, remember, it's sunset and the sun is going down. And so they ran over to see. That's not true. They paddled over to see, and they found Mr. Rogers in the red bird on the rocks. The natives took him to a house in Napo in their canoe and carried him all the way, as he could neither sit nor stand. About midnight, I heard where he was and went down to see him. So I'm just going to stop the letter for a minute. So here we are in Kona. It's midnight. Sheriff Neville is up here in his house, not very far at all from Kalukalu, not far from Christchurch, and a messenger obviously comes to his house. It's not the telephone ringing, there is no telephone. The messenger comes and says, oh, you better get yourself down to Napo, down by the coastline. We have something to show you. So I'd like to think that Sheriff Neville probably went outside and got a horse and saddled up and got a torch or a lantern. He got a lantern. He's not going to ride around on his horse with a torch. That's crazy. He'll catch something on fire. But he gets his lantern, he gets his horse, and he has to head at least 3 miles down to Napo in the dark. And maybe the messenger who came up is going with him. Maybe he's riding on the horse too. And they're all, or maybe he came up on a horse. Who knows? They didn't write these details down. But it's the middle of the night. It is dark. It is August. And it's creepy. So Sheriff Neville arrives at Napo on the shore. I found that Glennie had died out at sea and that they had been 10 days without food or water. That previous to the death of Glennie, Rogers, is one of the builders of the boat, Mr. Rogers, had opened a vein in his arm, and drawn out some blood, some of which he drank himself, and he gave some to Glennie. But Mr. Glennie would drink repeatedly of salt water and finally became delirious, and he died about 5 days before the sloop came in. That Rogers, when he found or thought that Glennie was dead, cut Glennie's throat and drew the blood into a bucket, all of which he drank. When that was done, he cut out the liver to suck on it and also eat part of the body. And finally cut off the lower part of the body and threw the rest overboard. I found part of the body in the sloop and called a coroner's jury whose decision is not yet given. I had the remains put into a coffin and took it up the hill where the Reverend Williamson gave it a Christian burial. This is still the letter. Now the question arises with the coroner's jury, and it is this. If the body was dead when Rogers cut the throat of poor Mr. Glennie, would the blood run? And if not, then is it fair to presume that life was not extinct? Was Rogers guilty of murder, manslaughter, or what? I wish to know how to proceed in this case, and wish that you would consult with the Attorney General and let me know by the return of the steamer. Rogers, the survivor, is in a very low state, and I have done all in my power to help him and bring him round. And the Reverend Williamson has been very kind in assisting. Glennie had nothing, and I had to pay all the expense digging the grave, making the coffin, and hiring Kanaka labor to get the sloop on the beach. Ought not all expense come out of the owners of the sloop, seeing that Glennie was hired by them to sail the sloop? Kona is certainly getting into notice, for I think this case is the most dreadful that has ever occurred. I remain yours, respectfully, R.B. Neville. Well, undoubtedly, such a literally bloodthirsty event, Kona did get into notice. And by August 17th, so this is now, 10 days later, in 1867, an article appeared in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, this is a regular Honolulu newspaper, entitled Horrible Suffering at Sea Off the Kona Coast. This is a great article, and you can read it. You can go look in the digitized newspaper collection of the University of Hawaii, and you can find it under August 17th, 1867, Horrible Suffering at Sea. It's on the 3rd page. It's good fun. And this letter was written under a pseudonym by Hualalai. And this means that who wrote this letter is a Paris. And either it's the Reverend John D. Paris Sr., a missionary who lived right at the top of Ka'awaloa and whose house, Mauna Olani, looks right over Kealakekua Bay, or it is his daughter, Ella, because Ella, in her more mature years, translates English hymns into Hawaiian and writes Hawaiian hymns, and she always says it's by Hualalai. And this letter is written by Hualalai, but at this time, Hualalai would have been a 15-year-old teenager. But she might have done it. Well, anyway, so she writes a letter, and she is incensed that one human being could eat another. She thought that was shocking, shocking, shocking. And she was also very concerned that the Hawaiian government was not paying attention to the safety of passengers, because what if an innocent wife and little children had gotten on this boat to go to Kau and had died out there in the sea with Mr. Rogers and Mr. Glennie? So mercifully, she writes that this little sloop, the Red Bird, sailed on the coast, got as far as Kapalilua, and the only passenger had the brains to get off the boat and keep going on foot to get to his final destination. But that Mr. Rogers and Mr. Glennie went back out to sea. So Glennie's remains were given a Christian burial by the Reverend Charles Williamson. He is the new, young, like 26-year-old, pink-nosed, blue-eyed minister who's built Christ Church. He's just arrived in Kona in 1867. He doesn't even have a real graveyard. The bishop has not come and consecrated the ground, but he buries Mr. Glennie there, and it's only Mr. Glennie's partial remains. So we will find out. Partial remains, what does that mean? So, Mr. Williamson is great, and I'm going to show you just this little picture because you can see all these pictures. This is the graveyard of Christ Church today, looking out at the beautiful, innocent blue Pacific. And Mr. Glennie's grave is right there, that little dot. There's a little plaque there, William F. Glennie. It looks so peaceful and calm, doesn't it? But back in 1867, that was a cow pasture. It was not all pretty. There were no graves. It was just grass and a mess. And Mr. Glennie got decently buried there. Okay, so, there's the small mound in the grassy graveyard with the bronze plaque is all that remains to recall the unlucky maiden voyage of the Red Sloop. Yes, horrors. And see, what's kind of funny when you're the historian is that Sheriff Neville, the man who is writing the letter to Honolulu, asking what to do, will be dead in a year and a half. And he, Charles Williamson, will be standing over his body in a coffin. These are the things we don't know. So, naturally, the story of Glennie lingered in Kona, told and retold as a reminder of the dangers at sea and perhaps the madness of men's minds. Nowhere did this story linger longer than at Ka'awaloa. That is the little village where Captain Cook's monument is today down by the sea. So it was a small settlement in now we've gotten to 1887. So this is the story again. See, if you have an archive, you can go back and find the same story over and over again. So this is taken from the Journal of an English Artist. This is nice Robert Barnfield. He came to Hawaii in 1855 because he had asthma. So, if you can't breathe, many times the doctor said, come into a warm climate, you're going to have a great time, breathe the cool air of the Pacific or the warm air of the Pacific. So Mr. Barnfield is a talented artist. King Kalakaua has sent him to Ka'awaloa to paint the spot where Captain Cook was killed because he wanted a painting of that place, and there was no monument yet. It was just rocks and the cliff and the sea. And so he came, and Barnfield likes Ka'awaloa, and he returns often and stays at a funny little ramshackle, it's not a hotel, but they called it Barrett's Hotel, and it's run by an Englishman and his Hawaiian wife, and they have a son, Moses, or Moki. So tonight, Robert Barnfield and Moki are sitting down at the edge of the rocks at Ka'awaloa, and you can imagine it's dark and the waves are lapping, and they're trying to scare each other by telling stories. So, there they are, and he writes in his journal, this is April 21st, 1887. A couple of nights ago, Moses and I sat talking after supper, and conversation turned on hardships endured by shipwrecked crews. I told him about the 2 men who killed and ate the boy on board of the Mignonette, and 1 or 2 other enlivening stories. And then he sailed in with the following. So Moki is telling the story. 2 white men, Americans, built a small boat up on the hill, fitted her up with a mast and sails, etc., and then brought her down to Ka'awaloa. And after laying in a small stock of goods with water and provisions for a few days, set sail for a coasting cruise around the islands, says Moki, with a view to trading, or peddling, as Moses termed it. The boat was named the Red Bird. This is our same little sloop. After they had been out a little over a week, one of the little schooners reported having fallen in with the Red Bird and supplied the 2 men with food and water, of which they had run out. Another week or so elapsed, little over a fortnight from the time they had started, and some natives out fishing with torches one night saw something close against the rocks, just below Ka'awaloa. They paddled up to it and found it was the Red Bird with the sail up and bumping against the rocks, in danger of swamping. They got on board and found only 1 of the men, and he appeared to be exhausted. So they got him into a canoe and took the Red Bird in tow across the bay to Napo. Some of the natives remained in the boat, and after the manner of Kanakas began the manner, everybody, people are curious, they're going to look at what's in this boat. So they began to rummage around after any small articles to attach. The first thing they happened upon was a bucket with 2 or 3 pieces of meat salted down. This was a great find for them, because they didn't get meat every day, and 'twas as much as they could do to restrain their appetites from eating it raw. However, they very soon arrived at Napo, and the man was got ashore, and food and drink given him. But in many inquiries as to his friend, like, "Hey, Mr. Rogers, what happened to Mr. Glennie?" he would only say that the man was make, dead in Hawaiian. This was not enough. The people wanted more details, and the man was too silent on the matter. By the time the bucket of meat was brought up, together with some more pieces that had been found in the bottom of the boat, and on bringing it into the full light, and remember, this is nighttime. This boat has been discovered at night. We are now on the porch or the backyard of a house down in the sands of Napo, and again, we're dealing with torches and oil lanterns, and the light is flickery and kind of eerie, and we're thinking, what is going on? Well, they got those pieces of buckets of meat and the pieces of meat, and they brought it into the full light, and they were horrified to discover it was human flesh. Ah! One of the pieces found in the boat was the whole of the skin of the breast and the stomach and the abdomen, the upper portion bearing the tattooed anchor and chain done in black and red, by which they recognized the missing man. Of course, everybody, you're a man or you're down at the beach, you don't wear a shirt half the time, and they all knew that was Mr. Glennie's tattoo on his chest, and now here it was in a bucket in the bottom of the boat. The survivor, this is Mr. Rogers, was taken to Honolulu and charged with the murder of Glennie. But the charge could not be proved. He said they ran out of food and water, and Glennie succumbed to the starvation. As soon as he was dead, Rogers said, he took a knife and he opened a vein, and a small quantity of blood was caught in the bucket and drank by Mr. Rogers. And then he cut up the body and he put the portions of it into the buckets with the salt, not knowing how much longer he would be becalmed. So they're out there in the Red Bird. They've gone too far. There's not much wind off the coast of Kona sometimes because Mauna Loa is a great big wall that stops the trade winds. We don't have the trade winds here. You have to know what you're doing to be able to sail, and they don't know what they're doing. And Mr. Barnfield says in his journal, he says, "It strikes me as a very lame tale. It takes more than 2 or 3 days of starvation to kill a strong man." Well, it's not 2 or 3 days of starvation. It's like 5 days, 6, 7, 8 days. Most men would suffer the pangs of hunger for much longer before they could eat the flesh of a dead companion. The general belief was that the 2 men had had a difference and that Glennie had been murdered. If this was not a proof of the survival of the fittest, it goes a long way to prove the survival of the strongest. Well, dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. So poor Mr. Rogers. Yes. So this is still Mr. Barnfield. He asked Moki, "I asked Moki what became of the murderer. He said the man got a berth as a seaman on a ship leaving Honolulu, and one night, while reefing a sail in a squall, he was blown off the yard arm and into the sea, where of course he drowned. Because if you're way up high in a sailing ship and you're blown off the yard arm and you maybe can't swim, you're going to die. Ew, ew, ew." And so ends this story. Did anyone know the truth? Well, no, nobody knows the truth. When I told this story, cute Alexis, who is not here with us today, said, "Oh my gosh, maybe Mr. Rogers committed suicide. Maybe he was so tired of being blamed for the death of Mr. Glennie that he just couldn't take it anymore. And so he climbed up to the mast and saw a good opportunity and just threw himself into the ocean." I don't think so. I think this was a man who was hanging on to life. He'd already survived this ghastly red bird thing, so he was not just going to throw himself into the water. So, when I was planning on telling this story to you, because I like this story, because, of course, for years I have done graveyard tours of Christ Church. And Mr. Glennie is buried there, the first person buried. And apparently when he was first buried, and remember, they're just parts of him buried. I was thinking, did Sheriff Robert Neville get a very small coffin? Because he didn't need a very big coffin, because he's missing many, many parts of poor Mr. Glennie. Maybe he had a teeny tiny coffin. But our sister Megan always says that the mound was large and impressive, and that when people came walking down the pathway to Christ Church, you'd cast your eye off to the side and see this kind of disturbing mound, and then everybody would have to remember this story of kind of ew. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought about, here we are in Kalukalu at the Greenwell store. And of course, this is the domain of Mrs. Greenwell, young Elizabeth Caroline Greenwell, who arrives here basically a little less than a year after this dreadful story has happened. And she arrives at Kealakekua Bay, and when Mr. Greenwell, she gets on her little side saddle because she's a lady and she's not going to ride astride like Isabella Bird. And they're going to come up here and they're going to be here at Kalukalu, and I'm sure Mr. Greenwell is crossing his fingers that his new young bride is not of a nervous disposition, that she is tough, because she's not going to make it here in Kona unless she's tough, because there are no handy little stores up here. There is no Women's Relief Society. It is Mrs. Greenwell and the house, maybe the store, or maybe not. And when they arrive, Kona is kind of all in a tiz, because it's been the hugest earthquakes of all time have been happening in the early part of 1868, when Mr. Greenwell leaves here in 67 to go on his trip around the world looking at citrus trees. So he is not here. He finds Mrs. G, his future bride, in like March in Montserrat, and they get married in April. They're back here in June. And while he was gone, Mr. Glennie is eaten, Christchurch is built, and the largest earthquake of all time has happened down in Kauai. And so when he brings his bride back to Kona, people are all like, oh, lucky you, Mr. Greenwell, man. You know, lucky your house is still standing. Lucky, you know, you weren't here and have to go to the burial service for Mr. Glennie. And oh, your young wife, ooh, you know, is she going to make it? Is she going to be able to live this isolated, lonely, kind of very Spartan life here in Kona? So there's a kind of famous story in the Greenwell family, and I like to think it ties into the death of Mr. Glennie, because one of the very few white women in Kona who is not married to a Hawaiian man or is like a lady of ill repute, who only knows, but is Mrs. Paris. So the Reverend John D. Paris, his second wife, Mary Paris, lives 2 miles down the road overlooking Kealakekua Bay. And of course, the nice thing to do would be for Mrs. Paris to invite Mrs. Greenwell, the new bride, to come to her house for tea, because everybody knows English ladies love tea, and probably American ladies like tea too, so she could have a little tea. And this is when young Ella is there, who was 15 in 1867, and by this time, 1868, now she's 16 years old. So she's probably old enough to be at the tea table with her mother. She doesn't have any, she has 2 older sisters, but they're not there, and her brother certainly isn't there. So it's just Mrs. Paris and Miss Paris and Mrs. Greenwell. And I'm sure Mrs. Greenwell is trying to be best behavior and not embarrass the entire British Empire by saying something dumb, so she might be very quiet. But anyway, I was thinking to myself, this tea party was not a success. The Greenwell family knows this story very well. It is one of the stories that has persisted, and Billy Paris knows this. When Mrs. Greenwell had her tea time with the Parises and got up to leave, maybe to go outside and get back on her horse, maybe Mr. Greenwell was out there waiting for her by the water trough, Mrs. Paris said to her, "Oh, my dear, a little reminder from the Bible, set not thy foot too often in thy neighbor's house, lest he weary of thy continual presence." So, I think Granny Greenwell put her little nose in the air and gave Mrs. Paris the steely look that said, "I will not be darkening your door to the end of time, Mrs. Paris," and turned away and went onto her horse. But I also like to think, during that tea time table, maybe Mrs. Paris had to go off to the kitchen to get hot water or check if the lemon cookies had burned, and left Granny, who was about 26 years old, at the table with young 16-year-old Ella Paris. And if Ella Paris thought she should say to Mrs. Greenwell, "Oh, by the way, Mrs. Greenwell, have you noticed Mr. Glennie's mound at the foot of Christchurch?" And I was thinking, I bet Mrs. Greenwell would say, "Well, no, dear, I haven't noticed any mound. I've been so busy watching where I walk over the hilo grass that I don't fall down. I've not been looking for mounds, and there is not a big marker. There's nothing. Maybe there's a tiny wooden cross, but I didn't notice it." And I was thinking, then Hualalai, because this would be Hualalai if she wrote that letter, would come out to Mrs. Greenwell and say, "Well, you know, something very exciting happened here in Kona last year, and I had to write a letter to the editor, and let me tell you all about Mr. Glennie, and when he died, and Mr. Rogers had to slit his throat and drain his blood into a bucket and drink it all up, and then take the liver out and suck on it and put it in a bucket of salt." And knowing how teenagers love to shock grown-ups, I was thinking, I wonder what happened. And then Mrs. Greenwell would come back here to Kalukalu, and Mr. Greenwell might ask his young wife, hoping that she had had some fun, a diversion, had found perhaps a sympathetic friend in Mrs. Paris. And I like to imagine him saying, "My dear, did you have a pleasant visit at Mrs. Paris's house. And she would say, as a matter of fact, it was not a success. I don't think I will be going back to Mauna Alani anytime soon. And of course, we don't know if that happened. Time passes. Mrs. Paris and Mrs. Greenwell do become friends. Ella Paris is a saint. She's a wonderful young lady. She's probably very inspirational to the young Greenwell girls. But that was not a great beginning for tea time. So, I am here, Audrey. So where are we in this time frame?
We have about 10 more minutes if you need them.
Well, we have about 10 more minutes. So, I was going to tell you a teeny bit about Mr. Neville, because since I might not see you for Lord knows how long, right? None of us can tell. I might get COVID-19 and my fingers might drop off. I won't. We're very healthy here. We are so lucky. The island of Hawaii is ultra fortunate to be extremely healthy. So we're not going anywhere. But okay, Robert Neville. So, Robert Neville is the sheriff. And sheriffs get called upon to do a lot of interesting things that nobody else gets called upon to do. So poor Sheriff Neville had to go down and see the dead body first and write to Honolulu and pray he got an answer. We don't have an answer. If they wrote an answer back saying it must be murder, it was never found. It's not in the archives. But a year and a half later, Robert Neville is here. And so this is in the fall of 1868. So Granny Greenwell is here in her house. I like to think the store is here, but we don't know. And Robert Neville is given the nasty job of evicting people. If you have somebody on your land and you have to evict them, and they won't go the first time, you get Sheriff Neville. And he comes with his Hawaiian maka'is. These are his deputies who help him do whatever he has to do. Catch the wild horse, take the tree off the road. Who knows what he had to do. But all those big earthquakes back in 1868, the early part of 1868, before Mr. Greenwell got here, made a Hawaiian man here in Kona, Mr. Kaona, believe that the end of the world was coming. And he's a Christian, and he believes in the Bible, and he's educated and smart, but he got this kind of crazy idea that the end of the world was coming, and he became like an inspirational leader. And he told all sorts of people the end of the world was coming, and the only thing they could do was to come with him and live in a commune and be down at Kalukalu Beach and wait for the end days. And when the end days came and the big final earthquake came and everybody else was wiped out, he, Mr. Kaona, would still be standing with his followers, and maybe they could all fly up into heaven. And that would be a lot of fun. But he was living on land that did not belong to him, and his 300 followers were also with him down at Kalukalu Beach. And so poor Sheriff Neville, of course he didn't think he was poor Sheriff Neville, he thought he was lucky Sheriff Neville. He had the law on his side and he had a good job. He is asked by Mr. Roy to evict Mr. Kaona and his followers, go on somebody else's land at the beach. They're down there trying to plant beans, fast crops, because they're not going to be here on Earth long because the end days are coming, but they won't go. So Sheriff Neville rides down there with his assistants, and they hang up the eviction sign and they pound it onto a tree, and then they all see Mr. Kaona come and get the eviction sign and take it off and rip it up into tiny pieces and throw it on the ground and step on it with his foot, because Mr. Paris, Ella's father, writes this in his little diary. So Sheriff Neville has to try again. This is not a man who gives up. He does not give up. He tries to get to the bottom of things. So he takes his maka'is and he takes a bunch of people. He's not just going down there because there are 300 followers with Mr. Kaona. So he needs hundreds of people with him. I don't see how he can have hundreds, but he has a lot. So they kind of ride down to Kalukalu Beach. It's like a posse, for crying out loud, with a sheriff, with his deputies. And they come down, and unfortunately they have a gun. This was a bad idea. And Sheriff Neville is getting his English anger up, and he's feeling like he's being trampled on, and he goes down and says, Mr. Kaona, you will be evicted now with all your people, or else, bang with the gun, ha-ha! This is Audrey giving me 5 minutes, it's true. So very unfortunately, it's like somebody ropes Mr. Neville off his horse and drags him to the ground and smashes him with, Lord knows what, a shovel. They kill Sheriff Neville, so he dies down on the sands of Kalukalu Beach, just a few miles from here, and one of his maka'is with him is also killed. And of course the posse rides away, But the posse wanted to ride away with Sheriff Neville's body, but they were not allowed to have it. So, once again, these players in this drama of Kona, they're right here. So the news flashes through Kona. Of course, people running around it on horseback, help, help. Sheriff Neville's murdered. And the word goes right to Christchurch, right to little Christchurch, right up the road, the little building colored gray with sand thrown on wet paint, kind of an old-fashioned painting method. And they say, Reverend Williamson, help, help. Sheriff Neville goes to your church. His body is lying down there dead. Don't you want to bury it? And of course he does. He wants the body back. And so Reverend Williamson, right there at Christchurch, gets on his horse and rides right here, right by Kalukalu, right by the old store. He runs out. Help! And he says, come help me get the body, Mr. Greenwell. And they ride down to get the body, but guess what? It's not given to them. And that's the beginning of another story that we will pick up when I see you again, oh Facebook followers. So aloha, take care of yourself. We're all just fine here in the Greenwell store. Kona Historical is doing very nicely. Buy a t-shirt. They're having some cute t-shirt sales, so go to the website, get a ranching t-shirt. Then you can learn to rope. Just like the old Hawaiian cowboys. All right, Audrey, I'm saying aloha, bye-bye.